Well, on that note, let me say, you all are being the change we want to see, and we cannot thank you enough. And we will try to take the model that you've presented and find ways to replicate it. And the other models, I'm willing to, it would be very interesting if we really could get an inventory of these programs. And I think there's going to be a common core here of what they do, because the facing what you did, really understanding, beginning to heal, is the common core for all these programs. And this is the time to get it on a larger scale. So thank you so very much for coming. We appreciate it. We look forward to further conversations, and please do submit proposals in writing that we can look at as we look at our budget as we move on. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
This is actually a good segue into our next discussion item, which is the Office of the Inspector General reporting on rehabilitation in our prison system, the formal rehabilitation programs run by CDCR. And I see that CDCR is also represented.
Senator, if I may, Ms. Tidwell stepped up just to answer that last question regarding the inventory.
The inventory, thank you.
Yes, because it does exist. It has been presented to us at CROB in the past, and so they actually are the holders of it, if you will. So I'll let her address how you can get a copy of that.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, our Division of Adult Institution maintains that list for our inmate leisure time activity groups.
That's right. I didn't know if it was called self-help or leisure time activities.
Yes, AKA ill tags. Yes, and so that list of volunteers is maintained, and you are correct in your assertion about other programs that are similar in nature, and there's a wide variety and hundreds of volunteers that are statewide. So, and then I'd be happy to come up at the end of the presentation to answer the questions from CDCR about the CROP report.
Okay, why don't you stay right there?
Oh, absolutely. I'll be happy to
That's good. But I would like, if you could make available to the committee that inventory.
Sure.
And I'm assuming it's a list of programs and at which prison we can find them.
Yes, Senator, yes. I'd be happy to provide that.
Now, Ms. Mitchell and I will be visiting the women's facility in Chowchilla tomorrow. If you happen to have the data for Chowchilla and could email it
I'll get it to you this afternoon.
I would appreciate it.
Sure.
Thank you very much for informing that visit.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. I, again, apologize for going a little bit out of order in my presentation, and I appreciate being given the opportunity to address the committee once again on, I think, this very important arena that we're talking about. And I always feel a bit inadequate when I hear firsthand accounts from those that are actually either former inmates, former victims, persons who work in the system, both paid and volunteer. But those of you, well, at least Senator Hancock, Senator Anderson, when I was confirmed, know my backstory, and I had hoped that Senator Leno would be here just to remind that aside from working for the Inspector General's office since 2005, formerly I was a prosecutor in probably what I would say is one of the most conservative counties in the state of California. And as such, however, I think it's important to understand that generalizations of any kind are difficult in this area. And so, for example, for me, certainly the Senator's comments about receiving a letter from a district attorney, our deputy DA, regarding his letters resonates with me, having prosecuted cases for 17 years, including gang cases for the majority of that, over 20 murder cases, including capital cases, as a prosecutor. However, again, while I saw that cynicism in some of my colleagues, I think, again, it's a dangerous generalization, and there are many of us, prosecutors, current prosecutors, former prosecutors, that have a strong belief in redemption and went into the profession wanting to make sure that the system as a whole worked, which is one of the reasons that I chose to work for the Inspector General's office in the first place. So with that preparatory statement, I would simply remind the committee that I'm going to keep my comments short because much of the work that we've done in terms of programming is being reported. And so we put out our CROB report last week. Hopefully the members have gotten a copy of that. And we also had the blueprint report, which went out yesterday, that I know some of you have a copy of, but we can certainly get a copy to you, which within its 5 components of areas that we monitor the department's progress is a rehabilitative piece. So that came out yesterday. And within both those reports, there's some overlap, certainly, and it looks primarily at those programs being run by the department. And I'm sure Senator Hancock recalls my statements, and I forget which hearing, quite frankly, it was, but one of the earlier hearings where I commented on what I see as a real value within these ILTAGs and programs such as GRIP. I've actually talked to an inmate who's participated, myself at San Quentin, and as I said before, and I'll reiterate, and as Senator Anderson alluded, it really is a situation where we can give them all of the state-provided programs we want to, but until that person decides to do that themselves, to have that change from within and rehabilitation is meaningful. And then, of course, the next issue is the very difficult one for our colleagues in parole, and to determine who's actually done that or not. So, with all of that, I will address some of the questions that I was provided previously. One of them was regarding the treatment services within CDCR. Excuse me, what effectiveness or how effective are the programs? And what I will tell you is that CROB, in large part, relies on the department itself to report on their effectiveness, and so we receive data from the department. While I have staff that go out and visit the prisons on an annual basis, it really ends up being more anecdotal and snapshots in time of how things are occurring and what programs are working at that point in time. So, for example, in the last CROB meeting, my analyst who's done that this last year reported on successes she's seen and challenges in programming. And the department obviously is there and hears all of that information. But at the end of the day, really what we've asked the department to do, and has been challenging in the last few years, because of the state of flux that rehabilitation has found itself. The big cuts a few years ago, and then money being put back in, and then the inception of CROB in 2007, programs being changed, modified virtually every year, changes in personnel and who's leading up the rehabilitation efforts at CDCR, at least 3 iterations through my tenure in the last couple of years as the IG, academic models changing, vocational courses changing, population changing drastically, movements of level 2 inmates, which again I would remind everyone are the ones that are primarily going to be getting the bulk of the programming and reentry. We are just now perhaps finding ourselves at a place where population is going to stabilize to a point that someone can actually stay in a program they start at the same place. And again, I'm talking about primarily those level 2 people. And as the board has stated in several of our CROB reports, much of this has made it very, very difficult to create a baseline and then establish a way of determining effectiveness of programming. That said, the department does report on individual programs and their successes. We've had, for example, KDAC and SAP programs that have come up and given presentations to the board, the CROB board, and talked about their successes. All of this is underscored by the point I made before, and that is the logic model. The experts on the CROB panel that are academics and researchers themselves and involved in this business every day, from the UC system, et cetera, all come back to evidence-based. And the catch-22 that I talked about before, and I'm sure the director from the GRIP program understands only too well is that until you have funding and can put a program out and the research can be done, there's that catch-22 of how do you provide the evidence for the efficacy of your program. And so I know, programs to be given a chance, and again, I haven't talked to my colleagues at BSCC about this, but, that board was created in large part, it's got a research function, and I know there are, in the past, similar boards that have dealt with grants, basically the establishment and way of providing grants to nonprofits and determining which grants should go out, and then more, or at least as much important, is following up with that research so that at the end of, say, a program, if GRIP was to be funded, you would have a research-based evidence for the work that they were able to do. So I don't know if that's something that the committee or the legislature would consider seriously, but it might be, again, an alternative to, and I don't want to downplay the department's efforts. The department has anger management, and they have contractors that come in and give those programs. But as we talked about again in the last hearing that I was in front of, that's limited right now, primarily, not entirely, but focused on those reentry hubs, which, as we know, is not all of the prisons and certainly not all of the population and certainly not the lifers or those that are being represented, I think, in GRIP, which really are folks that are doing longer terms for violent crimes. So, I would point out that the board has had many conversations about outcome data, and now you throw into that whole mix realignment. And as a result, we can't track what happens after an inmate leaves prison, not that we were tracking it very well before, but because now we have what's going on in the jails and what programs are there. And if someone went through a program in prison and then was released and ends up in jail, are they going to continue in a similar or a different program? So there are a lot of challenges, I think, they're looking at what happens to someone out of prison, and we haven't done a good job up until now of tracking those things other than anecdotally when programs such as GRIP or some of the programs I've heard from at CROB do it on their own. And I think I mentioned to the senator the program that they had that Senator Louie was involved in down south where, they did their own numbers, but again, that's anecdotal. So at the end of the day, I think it's important that the department continue to try to find a good way of developing outcome data, that whatever programs the legislature does decide to fund, there also be a research component of that so they can establish outcome data. And again, I know that you will have questions about all of this, but my office, as part of our functions in reporting on the department, while we talk to staff and people involved in those ILTAGs and those volunteer programs, it's not the primary focus of what we're asked to do. We're really asked to look at how our CDCR program is running. And to that end, these reports have appendixes, both the CROB report and the blueprint report, where you can see where programs are at that are run by the department, what kind of participation there is, et cetera. Those numbers are all available. I would recommend Senator Hancock, prior to your visit, if you want to look at the blueprint and the CROB report, the appendix for Chowchilla, CCWF, it'll show you the types of programs that are there now. But what it won't do is go into any depth on the inmate-led or inmate leisure programs, the ILTAGs and the volunteer programs. So I think you can get that information certainly from Ms. Tidwell. The next area that I was asked to speak about, and again, I'm trying to hit all of these briefly because I think a lot of this is covered in our reports, and that was PIA. So prison industries, I know that committees have had presentations before. I've had presentations at CROB. It's an interesting situation in this respect. It all depends on your perspective. So PIA has good results, but I think everyone would say that the inmates that they take in tend to be those that are more primed for success because they're taking lower level inmates that can go and work in the shops, etc. What I will tell you from my observations is I think it is a wonderful tool for incentive. So for example, I've been to DVI, Dual, and prison there where originally before realignment, when we had, inmates basically available to do these programs, it wasn't very hard finding the bodies. After realignment, you now have competing programs, if you will, whether it be the fire camps, PIA, all the other jobs that require gate passes, et cetera, at the prisons, competing for those low-level inmates, of which there are fewer. And even though the reclassification, I think, has been successful in moving 11,000 plus inmates from level 3 to level 2, for various reasons, not all of them will automatically qualify. But what I did see, and what I think is great about PIA is inmates want those jobs. They're good pay for an inmate job, and they're also good training for when they get out. And what's nice about it is PIA can actually require them to get their GED first or to work on their GED while they're in the program in order to get that job. So now you have an inmate who may not have been motivated to finish their education, has a reason to do so. And certainly the same could be true of other programs, and I know the department pushes academic education. The other thing is that when we look at partnering with PIA, it's all a matter of competing dollars. So, PIA requires funds, as do all of these programs, and there is a certain limit to that pot in determining where those funds are going to be sent and spent. But I think that CDCR, at least up until this last time around, I think, when all of that was being considered, showed a willingness to work with PIA, talk to PIA, partner with them on those programs that were available and able to continue. And I think while programs for the lifer population that we talked about are important, PIA programs really are designed to assist, again, in that vocational training prior to release. And so we have many lifers that are low enough level that can work in PIA, but by the same token, I think that we have to realize that PIA programs can be that source of incentive to increase GEDs, high school diplomas, literacy, all of those things, because they are coveted positions, if you will. And there may be ways that CDCR has already thought about this, but it occurs to me and my staff that we could certainly look at CDCR partnering with tying completion of certain vocational programs, such as carpentry or welding, with the subsequent movement into a PIA program, and maybe get creative and use some of those vocational curriculum the department has, like basic safety, communication, those types of things, as a precursor, if you will, to getting into a PIA program. And all of this sort of goes back to the point of one of the other questions, and that is having a roadmap for an inmate from the time they get into prison, having that plan of rehabilitation, if you will, that follows them. And I know one of the questions is what happens when they go from prison A to prison B. And yes, the C file, their basically history file within the system follows them, and you have counselors assigned to read that, but not again are all of those decisions. In fact, most of those decisions on moving an inmate are based upon what's best for the inmate. Totally understandable up until now, because we had things like the Valley Fever situation where hundreds of inmates had to be moved. You had the situation with movement because of the federal order and the caps. You have movement now because of the infills and the community correctional facilities and the reclassification and the new level 2 beds. So as I said before, hopefully the department is getting to a place where that stabilizes. And I really think that once that happens, I'm hoping, and I've heard the department, and I'm sure Ms. Tidwell will speak more on this when she has the opportunity, will come up with a way of not only managing, but being intentional in where an inmate goes from point A to point B to point C along their progression of rehabilitation. And wouldn't it be nice if we had programs dealing with self-help, if you will, self-insight along the way that could be linked with the vocational needs, the academic needs. You know, Mr. Mims had 20-plus years, and I'm sure it was not by any design. I'm sure it was, you know, luck of the draw where he ended up, what was available, and his own motivation to seek it or to ask for it from a counselor. I doubt very much, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe he would correct me, that anybody brought him in and said, here's what you need to do first, and then you go to this, and then you go to that, and then we're going to put you here. And really, I think at the end of the day, that's the goal that we should be seeking in our rehabilitative efforts with inmates. I say that not misunderstanding the difficulties involved, and again, not wanting to generalize that we could possibly do that for every single inmate in the system from the time they come in to they get out. But certainly I think we could do a much better job of it. And I think the thing that we have consistently reminded the department of, CROB, when I say we right now, I've got my California Rehabilitation Oversight Board hat on, is that that plan or that rehabilitation roadmap for the offender should follow them and should be, as I said, intentional, because I believe every time it gets looked at with a new set of eyes, depending on where they are, who the counselor is, or whatever, it's capable of being changed. And while inmates do have input, certainly they can talk to their counselors, my experience has been that it's pretty much what the department has available and what the department can or can't do for you, not out of any ill intention or lack of intention, just sometimes just lack of planning, lack of resources where that inmate finds themselves. I recently, well, it's been a few months now, my prison visits tend to sort of blur together sometimes, but I went to a prison where, due to the classification, this is an irony, but due to inmates being reclassified from level 3s to level 2s, they were being moved from jobs, vocational jobs that they had, which they were very pleased to be in and making progress, and yet the department, in trying to enact what they were told to do, had to move these folks. And there was, there were many of them clamoring for overrides and ways that they could stay in that prison, stay at that job because they were making progress. So that's just one example of, I think, an unintentional consequence when we try to sweep with that broad brush. And as far as, and I'll get to the last question and then take questions from you. As far as the last issue regarding CROB's requirements, and things that may change for CROB, what I would express to the committee and to the legislature is there's no question it provides an outlet for, or a forum for, outside advocates to come and address the board, and you literally have people up there that can make recommendations to the department, and you also have the opportunity for programs to present themselves to the board, and the department always has representatives there. And it's a way of continuing that transparency of what the department is doing in the area of rehabilitation. What we see, however, is both for my staff, and I think Secretary Beard would agree with me for his staff, you start bumping up against a diminishing return. And what I mean by that is you have staff like Ms. Tidwell and her folks that work with and for her who are asked to report to CROB and then a month later update the reports for the blueprint because it's the same area that we've been asked to monitor as part of the blueprint. And then my staff are doing the same thing, and you have a certain amount of redundancy there on both staff's part. And I think with BSCC starting up, they also have a certain amount of overlap now, in addition to which, and I think I shared this at the last hearing, our intake process in the last 2 years has become much more robust when it comes to responding to both inmate and staff's complaints about programming. And I will say that I find we're able to resolve many more issues on an informal level where I send my staff that are in the prisons every day directly to a warden or a principal and say, you know, we've got complaints about this teacher or this program or this officer who's keeping people from program or this yard that's going on lockdown for perhaps not rational reasons or things. We're able to resolve those because I've added a component now into my intake process that is responsive on that informal level, and I would say that the department in most cases responds very positive when we go out and have those informal resolution discussions. And so all of that to say that I think CROB was certainly created with a vital purpose. I think it still serves that purpose, but perhaps we could talk at some point about maybe reducing some of the redundancies in it. Having said that, I think that one of the benefits, if you will, of having any type of oversight for rehabilitation, whether it be what we do in our blueprint or what we do in our intake process or what CROB does in inviting programs, there is it enables us to, for lack of a better term, sort of check up, if you will, on the department, because of all the reasons I've given previously, the changes the department's under, the changes in staffing, the changes in programs and funding, et cetera, it's very easy to lose sight of that end goal that we're trying to get to. And again, if we lose sight of the ability for redemption, and I've heard the term now used by presenters and by the senator, and I would agree, then I think we as a society have failed, and we might as well just lock people up and throw away the key. Because really, without meaningful rehabilitation and the opportunities to do so, you know, we're going to fail again. So I would, again, be happy to answer questions from the board about either the CROB, our reports, or any other issues.
Thank you very much for your answers. Let me say that I am all for streamlining reports because I know they take up a lot of time and can take creative energy away from doing other things. If you can work with the BSCC and CROB and come up with a streamlined report that gives us the useful information we need, we would love to consider it, and I really invite you guys to do that. Let me say, having read both of the last CROB reports, there are some things that could be done to make them more useful for me as a policymaker. There were a lot of things in the original, the CROB report on September 15th, of last year, 2013, that were full of very interesting observations, issues that needed to be resolved. I didn't see all of them in the report we just got. Mm-hmm. So, what's the follow-up? It would be really helpful if we could define a checklist of goals.
Well, I think
we're report on those each time.
And that's one of the things that I've asked my staff to do now is set out the recommendations and basically reiterate, okay, this is what's happened on our past recommendations. We haven't done a great job doing that because, again, I'm the chair of the board. I have several other board members that are on the board, and so when the report gets written, it's a group effort, if you will. And so I don't have total authorship control. But what I will say is I think the board is in agreement that moving forward, we want to do exactly that. We want to make recommendations and continue to monitor those and the department's progress on them, because we are frustrated too that things that we've talked about in the past tend to, raise up again a couple years later and still without resolution.
Yeah, or maybe nothing happened. And I would also like information. You tell us kind of what enrollment might be and what the actual participation is. I think we need information on completed GEDs, completed vocational certificates?
So that's the question. I don't know if you asked me in here or not, but I know I've talked about before, and I know Ms. Tidwell knows it's coming. And, that's the biggest probably criticism I have of their target population for rehabilitation is the way they define success. And so person in a program for one day, while I do not believe, and I think it's an unfair probably inference, that the department is intentionally taking an inmate, putting them in a program for a day, taking them out, putting another inmate in for a day to get their numbers up, that would be absurd. I do believe that we need a more meaningful, because even if you hit those 55 to 70,000 inmates that have a high risk or high to moderate risk and a high to medium need that the target population is going to end up being, if you can't say that they actually completed programs, where is the meaningful measure of success?
Right.
Do we have a number? So I know Ms. Tidwell, I think, is going to respond to that when it's her opportunity to do so, or if you want to do it now. She's sitting here, but that's up to you.
Well, I actually want to talk a little bit more about the reports that we're getting
Sure.
from C-Rob, because useful information is what we're trying to zero in on here.
Right.
So, for example, sometimes I don't know what you're talking about in the reports. Like the very last page of the appendix.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I did
No,
read
go
this.
ahead.
Post-realignment substance abuse treatment program capacity, enrollment, and utilization. Now, last December it says the capacity was 1,286. Does that mean those are all the slots we have for 134,000 people in prison?
For that one program.